Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight, we will talk about what happens to consciousness after death. It's a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been able to wonder about the mysteries of life. Every culture, every religion, and every philosophical tradition has grappled with it in some way. But here, instead of starting with myths or beliefs, we're going to approach this from the perspective of neuroscience, what the science of the brain can actually tell us about consciousness, and what may happen when the biological machinery that supports it begins to shut down. Along the way, we'll explore some fascinating phenomena that occur in the final moments of life, and consider how the brain itself may generate the experiences people sometimes report near death. To start, let's ground ourselves in the first big question. What is consciousness in the first place? Neuroscientists don't have a final, agreed upon definition. Consciousness is not a single thing in the brain, like a light bulb you can point to. It's more like the integrated sum of countless processes working together. At the simplest level, consciousness is the state of being aware of yourself and your environment. It's the ability to have subjective experience, to feel, to perceive, to think, to know that you exist. The search for the neural basis of consciousness has focused on what scientists call the neural correlates of consciousness. These are patterns of brain activity that line up with subjective awareness. The cerebral cortex, especially the prefrontal regions, play a central role in self-awareness, memory, and decision-making. Meanwhile, the thalamus acts as a kind of relay station, integrating sensory signals and passing them to higher brain regions. Consciousness appears to require this intricate network, the thalamocortical system, to be active and connected. When this network is disrupted, as in deep anesthesia, coma, or certain brain injuries, consciousness fades or disappears. Now, if consciousness is tied to brain activity, then what happens as the brain begins to shut down at death? This is where things get both sobering and fascinating. Death is not a single moment, it's a process. The heart may stop beating within seconds, and circulation of oxygenated blood to the brain ceases. Without oxygen, neurons begin to malfunction rapidly. Within about 20 seconds of cardiac arrest, most brain activity measured by EEG goes flat. But that's not the end of the story. Recent studies have revealed that the dying brain doesn't simply switch off like a light. Instead, it can go through a kind of storm of activity. In 2013, a groundbreaking experiment with rats showed that just after cardiac arrest, their brains produced a surge of synchronized electrical activity, far higher than normal waking consciousness. This burst lasted about 30 seconds. Some scientists speculate that this may be the brain's last attempt to restore balance, or perhaps the final firing of interconnected networks as energy reserves collapse. What's even more intriguing is that similar patterns have now been observed in humans. In 2022, a team of researchers reported the recording of brain activity from an elderly patient who died while undergoing EEG monitoring for epilepsy. In the moments after the heart stopped, his brain also displayed a burst of high-frequency activity, especially in the gamma range, the frequencies most often linked with perception, memory, and consciousness. In other words, the very last measurable event in this man's brain was not silence, but a flash of activity that looks surprisingly similar to what we see during vivid experiences. This raises profound questions. Could this final burst be the neurological basis for the near-death experiences people often report? Many individuals who have come close to death describe leaving their bodies, seeing bright lights, feeling overwhelming peace, or experiencing a review of their entire life. From a neuroscientific perspective, these reports may correspond to the brain's last surge of activity under extreme stress. As oxygen deprivation sets in, the visual cortex may misfire, producing tunnels of light. The release of endorphins and neurotransmitters may create feelings of euphoria and detachment. Memory centers may be activated, leading to rapid recall of autobiographical events. But let's pause here, because we must remember that correlation is not proof. Just because the brain shows this surge of gamma activity doesn't mean it is causing a near-death experience. It could also be a final byproduct of the brain shutting down, without necessarily producing coherent subjective awareness. After all, the subjective nature of consciousness is notoriously difficult to measure. We only know what people report after being revived, but we cannot ask those who cross the irreversible threshold. Still, the fact that the brain doesn't go silent immediately, but instead shows these complex patterns at the end, challenges the idea of death as an instant cut-off. Instead, death looks more like a gradual unraveling of the neural systems that maintain our sense of self. The brainstem, which controls basic functions like breathing and heart rate, is among the last areas to shut down. Meanwhile, the higher cortical regions involved in identity and thought collapse sooner. This sequential failure suggests that you, the conscious self, may dissolve in layers rather than all at once. To make sense of this, let's think about how consciousness works in altered states. When you fall into deep sleep, your cortex disconnects from sensory input and consciousness fades. When you dream, fragments of memory and perception recombine into bizarre narratives. Under anesthesia, global brain connectivity is suppressed and you lose awareness. In brain injuries, specific networks can be damaged, leading to conditions like vegetative states, where wakefulness persists but awareness appears absent. Death might be viewed as the most extreme case of this, a total and irreversible breakdown of the networks that sustain awareness. Yet even within neuroscience, there's still debate. Some researchers argue that consciousness is more resilient than we realize, and that the brain's final activity may reflect a last spark of awareness, however brief. Others argue that what we see are merely mechanical discharges of neurons, without true experience. This uncertainty lies at the heart of the mystery. We can measure the brain's electrical activity, but we cannot directly access the subjective experience that may or may not accompany it. There's also the question of why evolution would shape the brain to produce such vivid activity at death. From a survival perspective, it might make sense. An animal under mortal threat might benefit from a heightened state of awareness in the final moments to escape or fight. The surge of activity could be a byproduct of the brain's desperate attempt to restore balance. But when survival is no longer possible, that same burst becomes the final flicker of the mind. Now let's zoom out and consider how all this affects our understanding of consciousness itself. If consciousness arises from brain activity, then its end seems inevitable when the brain ceases to function. Yet the exact boundary between fading activity and the complete absence of awareness is blurry. Science can tell us about neurons, networks, and electrical patterns, but whether subjective experience continues for seconds or minutes after clinical death remains an open question. This uncertainty is part of what makes the study of near-death phenomena so captivating. Neuroscience provides strong evidence that consciousness depends on the living brain, but at the same time, it leaves room for awe at the complexity of that transition. When people describe being pulled toward light, meeting loved ones, or feeling a sense of unity, it may be rooted in neurobiology, yet it also points to the remarkable capacity of the brain to generate experience even under the most extreme conditions. So in these opening thoughts, we've set the stage. We've looked at what consciousness is from a scientific perspective, how it relies on interconnected brain systems, and how those systems begin to break down at death. We've seen evidence of final burst of activity in the dying brain, raising the possibility that the transition out of life is accompanied by extraordinary internal experiences. And we've acknowledged that as powerful as neuroscience is, it cannot yet fully answer the ultimate question, whether awareness truly vanishes, or whether the subjective self lingers in some form, however briefly. This is where neuroscience meets mystery. It shows us the biological scaffolding that holds consciousness together, but it also confronts us with the limits of what can be measured. What we know so far suggests that death is not an on-off switch, but a complex process in which the brain's networks collapse in stages, and perhaps in doing so, generate the profound and sometimes beautiful experiences people describe near the threshold. In neuroscience, the self is not one single thing. It is an emergent property of many brain systems working in harmony. Your memories, your personality, your emotions, and your ability to recognize yourself as you are all built from countless neural circuits. As the brain begins to fail, these functions do not collapse all at once. Instead, they fade in sequence, and studying this sequence gives us important clues about the end of consciousness. One of the strongest pillars of the self is memory. The hippocampus, located deep in the temporal lobes, is essential for forming new memories and consolidating them into long-term storage. Without it, we cannot anchor new experiences into the narrative of our lives. Famous cases of patients with hippocampal damage show us how fragile this system is. Take the case of Henry Molaison, known as HM, who underwent surgery to treat severe epilepsy. His hippocampi were removed, and as a result, he lived the rest of his life unable to form new lasting memories. He remained conscious, but his sense of continuity, the ability to link one moment to the next, was shattered. This illustrates how memory is not just an accessory to consciousness, but a core component. Our awareness of ourselves depends on remembering what came before. As the brain dies, the hippocampus is one of the first areas affected by oxygen deprivation. Within minutes of cardiac arrest, the delicate neurons of the hippocampus begin to malfunction. Without memory, consciousness becomes fractured. If awareness continues briefly during the dying process, it may no longer have the anchor of continuity, leading to the fragmented and surreal quality often reported in near-death experiences. Another important element of the self is identity, the stable sense of who you are. Neuroscience has linked this to a network called the Default Mode Network, DMN. This system of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, is active when we are not focused on external tasks. It's the network that lights up when you daydream, recall autobiographical memories, or reflect on your place in the world. In other words, the DMN is central to constructing the narrative of self. Under normal circumstances, the DMN is balanced with task-positive networks, switching back and forth as we move between internal reflection and external action. But in states where brain function is disrupted, such as during psychedelics, deep meditation, or near death, the DMN can dissolve. People often describe a loss of ego, emerging with the environment, or a sense of timelessness.
As the dying brain loses oxygen, the DMN likely collapses quickly, stripping away the organized sense of I. This could explain why many near-death reports involve a feeling of merging into something larger than oneself. Neuroscience suggests that this is not a glimpse into eternity, but the disintegration of the brain's normal self-referential networks.
Let's also consider emotion, another pillar of conscious life. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure, is key to emotional processing. Under life-threatening conditions, the amygdala is highly active, triggering fear, arousal, and the release of stress hormones like adrenaline. But as the body fails, neurotransmitter systems swing wildly. Endorphins are released, flooding the brain with natural painkillers that create a sense of euphoria. Dopamine surges may create intense feelings of clarity or significance. The combination of fear, circuits firing, and chemical surges of pleasure could lead to the paradoxical mix of terror and peace that many people describe during close brushes with death. The frontal lobes also play a critical role here. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision-making, moral reasoning, and control of impulses. When oxygen drops, the frontal lobes are especially vulnerable. Their decline means less top-down regulation of emotional centers, allowing vivid emotions and hallucinations to run unchecked. Without the guiding hand of the frontal lobes, the experience of dying may feel dreamlike, chaotic, and outside of rational control. As memory, identity, and emotional regulation collapse, what remains of consciousness? Some neuroscientists argue that the brain may reduce to a state of raw perception. Flashes of light, bursts of sound, fragments of imagery. Others suggest that the final surge of gamma activity may allow the brain to briefly integrate these fragments into coherent, if fleeting, experiences. In this view, the dying brain may not simply unravel into static, but instead compose one last tapestry of perception before silence. Let's turn now to how these processes compare with what happens in certain brain disorders. Alzheimer's disease, for example, gradually strips away memory, identity, and eventually awareness itself. Patients lose access to autobiographical memory first, then the ability to recognize loved ones, and finally even basic self-awareness. In traumatic brain injuries, different networks can be knocked offline, producing conditions like the vegetative state, where patients cycle through sleep and wake but show no signs of awareness. These examples help us see death not as a unique phenomenon, but as the final endpoint of processes we already recognize. The breakdown of the brain's architecture for consciousness. This raises another important point. Consciousness is not localized to one spot in the brain. While certain regions like the hippocampus, amygdala, or prefrontal cortex are essential for specific functions, consciousness itself is a distributed process. It emerges from the interaction of many networks. That means when one network begins to fail at death, others may still fire for a time. This helps explain why dying does not appear to be an immediate blackout, but rather a staged deconstruction of awareness. Now let's consider how time perception may distort as the brain shuts down. Consciousness is not only about awareness of self, but also awareness of time. The brain constructs the flow of time using networks in the parietal cortex and basal ganglia. Under stress, these systems can malfunction, leading to time dilation. Survivors of near-death experiences often report that time seemed to slow down or even stop. From a neuroscientific perspective, this could reflect the breakdown of time processing mechanisms. If the dying brain loses its ability to order events properly, moments may feel stretched, eternal, or outside of time entirely. There's also evidence that the visual system plays a dramatic role in shaping final experiences. When oxygen levels drop, the retina and visual cortex are extremely sensitive. One of the most common reports in near-death accounts is the tunnel of light. Neuroscience provides a simple explanation. As the peripheral regions of the retina fail first, vision collapses inward, creating a narrowing tunnel. Meanwhile, overactivation of the visual cortex may produce bright flashes or patterns, giving rise to the archetypal light at the end of the tunnel. What about the so-called life review, where people report seeing their entire life flash before their eyes? Neuroscience suggests this too may have roots in the brain's activity. The temporal lobes, especially in the medial regions, are critical for storing autobiographical memories. Under abnormal firing conditions, such as seizures, people often experience vivid recollections of past events. In the dying brain, widespread activation of memory circuits may cause a flood of autobiographical recall, stitched together into the impression of a life review. Of course, all of this remains partly speculative. We cannot follow a conscious subject all the way through death to ask them what they experience. But by piecing together observations from survivors, from animal models, and from patients monitored at the edge of death, neuroscience offers a compelling framework. The collapse of memory networks explains the fragmentation of continuity. The dissolution of the default mode network explains the loss of ego and merging with a larger whole. The flooding of emotional circuits explains the intensity of feeling. The breakdown of time and visual systems explains distorted perception and the tunnel of light. Taken together, these insights suggest that what people experience as the final moments of consciousness may be a deeply biological process. The systematic unraveling of the brain's core networks. Each stage produces distinct subjective effects, from loss of identity to altered time to bursts of memory. These experiences may feel otherworldly, but they arise from the machinery of the mind itself. Still, there's something humbling in recognizing how much the brain can generate in its last moments. Even as its systems fail, it creates experiences that feel profound, transformative, even spiritual. Whether or not these experiences reflect anything beyond biology, they reveal the extraordinary creativity of the human brain in the face of its own ending. By definition, once a person has died, their subjective experience is beyond our reach. What we can study are states that come close. The moments of clinical death where people are revived, the deep unconsciousness induced by anesthesia, or the long silences of coma. Each of these conditions provides a kind of laboratory model for examining what happens when brain activity is reduced, disrupted, or nearly extinguished. And each one reveals fascinating insights into the resilience and fragility of consciousness. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, are perhaps the most widely known of these states. People who have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest often describe vivid experiences during the time when their brains were deprived of oxygen. Reports commonly include tunnels of light, feelings of floating above the body, encounters with deceased relatives, or a sense of profound peace. From a neuroscientific standpoint, these reports are invaluable because they offer a glimpse into the subjective side of the dying process. The question, though, is how these extraordinary experiences arise from brain function. One leading hypothesis is that they result from cerebral hypoxia, the lack of oxygen in the brain. Oxygen is critical for neurons to fire properly. When levels drop, brain cells become unstable, firing in bursts and disrupting normal signaling. This can lead to hallucinations, visual distortions, and altered states of consciousness. Experiments with pilot exposed to low oxygen in centrifuges have shown that many report tunnel vision, bright lights, or even out-of-body sensations. These parallels suggest that NDEs may be the natural outcome of a brain starved of oxygen. Another explanation involves neurotransmitters. Under extreme stress, the brain releases a cocktail of chemicals, endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, that can radically alter perception. Endorphins create feelings of euphoria and painlessness. Serotonin can generate hallucinatory imagery, and dopamine may amplify feelings of significance or meaning. The combination could explain why NDEs are not only vivid, but emotionally powerful. Neuroscience suggests that in the dying brain, neurochemistry is not shutting down smoothly. It's spiking and misfiring in ways that create unusual states of mind. There's also the intriguing possibility that electrical surges in the brain produce the coherence of these experiences. As we saw earlier, studies in both rats and humans show that gamma oscillations spike just after cardiac arrest. Gamma rhythms are associated with binding together different elements of perception into a unified whole. So even as the brain is collapsing, it may briefly generate intensely unified experiences. To the person undergoing it, this could feel like clarity, transcendence, or a vision of another reality. But near-death experiences are not the only altered state that teaches us about dying. General anesthesia provides another critical perspective. When you undergo anesthesia, consciousness shuts off, often within seconds. Yet anesthetics don't simply turn off the brain. They disrupt the connectivity between regions, especially between the thalamus and the cortex. This prevents the integration of information that consciousness depends on. Anesthetics also increase inhibitory neurotransmission, silencing neural circuits. In some ways, anesthesia is like a reversible model of death. Awareness is extinguished, but the machinery is preserved so it can restart later. What's fascinating is that anesthesia shows us just how fragile consciousness is. It doesn't take brain death to abolish awareness. A few molecules binding to receptors can do it. This suggests that consciousness is not a robust, unshakable force, but a delicate emergent property of precise neural communication. When this communication is disrupted, whether by anesthetics or oxygen deprivation, it unravels. That fragility reminds us of how narrow the boundary is between life and death, between being present and vanishing into nothingness. Coma and vegetative states offer yet another window. In coma, patients appear unconscious, eyes closed, with minimal response to stimuli. In vegetative states, they may open their eyes and show cycles of sleep and wake, yet without clear signs of awareness. For decades, such patients were assumed to lack consciousness entirely, but advances in brain imaging have complicated that assumption. Functional MRI studies have shown that some patients who appear unresponsive can still activate brain regions in response to commands. For example, when asked to imagine playing tennis, certain coma patients showed activity in motor planning regions, just like healthy controls. This discovery has huge implications for our understanding of consciousness near death. It shows that awareness can persist even when outward signs are absent. The brain may be more capable of sustaining fragments of consciousness under extreme damage or suppression than we once believed. This blurs the line between life and death even further. If a patient with massive brain injury can still show signs of covert awareness, what might a dying brain still experience in its last moments? Let's also consider seizures, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy. Patients with seizures in these regions often report out-of-body experiences, religious visions, or profound feelings of meaning. The electrical storms of epilepsy may mimic, on a smaller scale, the chaotic bursts seen in the dying brain. Studying these conditions shows us how abnormal activity can generate experiences that feel deeply real, yet are rooted in neural misfiring. Again, this helps us understand why dying brains, in their final storms, might produce extraordinary visions. Together, these altered states, near death, anesthesia, coma, seizure, paint a consistent picture. Consciousness is fragile, dependent on finely tuned neural networks. When those networks are stressed, suppressed, or failing, consciousness doesn't simply blink out. Instead, it shifts, distorts, and sometimes produces vivid experiences that feel unlike anything in normal waking life. From a neuroscientific perspective, these states are not glimpses into other worlds, but into the strange capacities of the human brain itself. And yet, there's a paradox. For those who undergo them, these experiences often feel more real than waking life. Patients revived from cardiac arrest sometimes say their near-death visions were the most profound events of their existence. Neuroscience can explain the mechanisms: oxygen loss, neurotransmitter surges, gamma oscillations, but it cannot fully capture the felt quality of the experience. This is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience arises from objective brain processes. The dying brain seems to bring this problem into sharp relief. We can see the circuits fail, we can measure the spikes of activity, but what it is like to undergo them remains hidden behind the curtain of subjectivity. One final aspect to consider here is the role of memory in reporting near-death experiences. When someone is resuscitated, what they describe later is not the raw experience itself, but their recollection of it. Memory is reconstructive, not photographic. The brain doesn't store perfect recordings of events. It stores fragments and rebuilds them later. That means near-death reports may be shaped, amplified, or distorted by the process of recall. The experiences may feel eternal in the moment, but what survives afterward is filtered through the machinery of memory. This adds another layer of complexity to interpreting what NDEs reveal about death. So what can neuroscience conclude from these comparisons? Altered states show us that the brain can generate vivid, coherent experiences even in the face of dysfunction or shutdown. They show us that consciousness can persist in forms we don't recognize, hidden beneath silence or paralysis. They show us that what feels transcendent or mystical can often be traced back to specific neural mechanisms. And they show us that the line between awareness and oblivion is not a sharp cliff, but a slope down which the brain slides in its final moments. What remains uncertain, and perhaps always will, is whether any of these states truly resemble the final passage into death. Near-death survivors, by definition, came back. Anesthesia is reversible. Coma can persist for years. Only death is final, and what lies beyond it, if anything, remains beyond the reach of science. But by studying these shadow states, neuroscience has brought us closer to understanding how the machinery of consciousness fails, and in doing so, has illuminated one of the most profound mysteries of human existence. When people talk about death, they often think of the heart stopping. For most of human history, that was the definition. When the heartbeat ceased and breathing stopped, a person was considered dead. But modern medicine has complicated this picture. With technologies like CPR, ventilators, and defibrillators, we can restart the heart and restore breathing. Someone whose heart has stopped is not necessarily beyond recovery. This has forced science to draw a sharper line between cardiac death and what is now called brain death, the irreversible cessation of all brain function. If we want to understand when consciousness truly ends, brain death is where neuroscience directs us. So what exactly is brain death? Clinically, it is defined as the complete and permanent loss of function in the entire brain, including the brainstem. The brainstem is crucial because it controls the most basic functions of life: breathing, heart regulation, reflexes like swallowing or pupil contraction. If the brainstem is dead, these functions cannot return. Importantly, brain death is not a temporary state. It is considered legally and biologically equivalent to death, even if machines can still keep the heart beating and the lungs moving. But arriving at this diagnosis is not simple. Doctors must follow strict protocols to ensure that brain death is not confused with other conditions like coma or vegetative state, which can appear similar on the surface. A patient in coma may be unresponsive with no signs of awareness, yet their brain may still show activity and potential for recovery. A patient in a vegetative state may even open their eyes, move or cycle through sleep and wake patterns. But if higher cortical function is severely damaged, they may lack conscious awareness. In both cases, the brain is not gone, it's impaired. Brain death, by contrast, is total. To establish brain death, physicians perform a series of neurological tests. They check for brainstem reflexes. Does the patient blink when the cornea is touched? Do the pupils respond to light? Does the patient gag or cough when the airway is stimulated? If all these reflexes are absent, it suggests the brainstem is no longer functioning. The apnea test is another key step. The ventilator is temporarily removed to see if the patient attempts to breathe on their own as carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. If no breath is taken, it indicates that the respiratory centers in the brainstem are irreversibly damaged. In some cases, confirmatory tests are used. An EEG may show no electrical activity across the cortex. Cerebral blood flow studies may reveal that no blood is reaching the brain at all, meaning the tissue has died. Taken together, these evaluations establish with near certainty that the brain has ceased functioning in every respect. At this point, medical science concludes that consciousness is no longer possible. Why is this the line? Because neuroscience tells us that consciousness depends on the coordinated activity of distributed networks in the brain. Without cortex, without thalamus, without brainstem, there is no structure left to generate awareness. The heart may still beat, powered by machines, but the person, the conscious being, is gone. This raises important distinctions. In coma or vegetative state, fragments of consciousness may still persist, even if hidden. In brain death, there is nothing left to sustain it. That makes brain death the clearest point at which we can say consciousness has ended. But the brain is not like a light switch. The path to brain death is gradual. Consider a case of severe head trauma or massive stroke. Swelling inside the skull can cut off blood flow, starving neurons of oxygen and glucose. Cells begin to die. As pressure builds, more and more brain regions fail. At first, there may still be signs of awareness, then only reflexes, then only faint electrical activity, until finally, even the brainstem shuts down. From the perspective of consciousness, this is like watching the lights in a city go out one neighborhood at a time until the whole city is dark. One of the great difficulties in neuroscience is pinpointing the exact moment when subjective experience disappears. The absence of reflexes and brainstem function tells us that consciousness cannot return. But when did it vanish? Was it in the first few minutes of oxygen deprivation? Did fragments linger as networks collapsed? We cannot ask the person at that threshold, so the answer remains elusive. What brain death gives us, instead, is the certainty of the endpoint. It's also important to recognize that brain death is not the same as persistent vegetative state, which is sometimes misunderstood in the public. The famous case of Terry Schiavo in the early 2000s brought this into the spotlight. She was in a vegetative state for years, her body sustained by artificial feeding, her brainstem still alive, but her higher brain severely damaged. Some argued she might still have some awareness, though neuroscience suggested otherwise. But crucially, she was not brain dead. In brain death, even the most basic neural circuits are gone, and there is no possibility of recovery. Another illustrative case is that of Jahi McMath, a teenager declared brain dead after a surgical complication. Her family disputed the diagnosis, pointing to the fact that machines could keep her heart beating and her body warm. But from the standpoint of neuroscience, the absence of brain function was absolute. She could be biologically sustained for a time, but the conscious person had already ceased to exist. Cases like this show how emotionally difficult brain death is to accept, even when science is unequivocal. The question of whether consciousness might somehow persist in brain death has been raised in speculative philosophy, but neuroscience offers a firm answer: no. Without neurons firing, without networks communicating, without blood flow, there is no mechanism for awareness. The analogy often used is a computer. If the hardware is destroyed, the software cannot run. Consciousness, as far as neuroscience can show, requires the hardware of the living brain. Yet even here, some mysteries remain. One is the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. This is when patients with severe dementia or neurological decline suddenly become alert and coherent shortly before death. Families sometimes describe loved ones who had not spoken in months suddenly recognizing them, speaking clearly, even sharing final thoughts. From a neuroscience perspective, this is puzzling. It may be that as networks fail, inhibitory circuits release a final burst of clarity before collapse, or it could be the same kind of electrical surge seen in dying brains. Either way, it suggests that the border between consciousness and unconsciousness is not a simple line, but a turbulent threshold. Another mystery is the so-called death wave. In animal studies, researchers have observed a massive release of electrical activity across the brain within a minute after cardiac arrest. This final storm, followed by silence, might mark the absolute end of neural function. Whether this storm carries subjective experience, or whether it is simply the mechanical discharging of neurons, remains unknown, but it shows that the brain has a final act, even as it dies. Ultimately, brain death provides science with a definition of when consciousness is no longer possible. It is the point at which all the systems that make subjective experience possible have irreversibly failed. In this sense, it represents the true scientific boundary of death. And yet, our fascination persists because of what lies just before that boundary. The moments when the brain is failing but not yet gone, when consciousness may still flicker even as the body is shutting down. These are the moments where subjective reports of near-death experiences arise, where families see signs of lucidity, where mystery lingers. Brain death may close the door, but it is the threshold leading up to it that continues to raise questions science cannot fully answer. In reflecting on brain death, we see the stark reality. Consciousness, as we know it, is a product of the living brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. But the journey to that point, the fading of memory, the collapse of self, the surges of activity, remains as complex and enigmatic as consciousness itself. For most of human history, death was hidden behind closed doors. It was private, mysterious, and largely unstudied. Today, with advanced monitoring technologies and the setting of intensive care units, science has begun to observe death more closely than ever before. Electroencephalograms, or EEGs, track brain activity down to the millisecond. Cardiac monitors show the exact moment the heart stops. Together, they have opened a small but fascinating window into what the brain does as life fades away. These studies are beginning to illuminate one of the most profound questions. What does the last moment of consciousness look like? Let's start with a remarkable case from 2022 that made international headlines. Doctors in Canada were monitoring an elderly patient with epilepsy using EEG when he suddenly suffered cardiac arrest and died. For the first time, they captured continuous brain activity before, during, and after death. What they saw surprised them. In the 30 seconds after the heart stopped, the patient's brain displayed surges of gamma oscillations, high-frequency waves often associated with memory recall, sensory integration, and conscious awareness. It was as though, in the moments after circulation ceased, the brain produced a final burst of coordinated activity. To neuroscientists, this was both thrilling and puzzling. Gamma waves are typically linked to higher cognitive functions. They are seen when we recall memories, when we experience vivid perceptions, or when the brain binds information into a coherent whole. Why would they surge just as the body was shutting down? One possibility is that as the brain loses oxygen, neurons fire synchronously in a desperate attempt to maintain function. Another is that inhibitory mechanisms collapse, unleashing uncontrolled bursts. Either way, this final storm raises the possibility that the brain's last moments may not be blankness, but intense and possibly meaningful activity. This finding echoes earlier research in animals. In 2013, scientists studying rats found that within 30 seconds of cardiac arrest, the animals' brains showed a surge of highly organized activity, including strong gamma oscillations. The rats, in effect, displayed brain patterns similar to those observed during wakeful consciousness, but compressed into a brief window after death had technically begun. These results challenge the assumption that the brain simply goes dark the instant the heart stops. Instead, they suggest that the transition into death may involve a dynamic and active process. What's particularly striking is how these findings match reports from people who survive cardiac arrest. Many describe life reviews, tunnels of light, or heightened clarity. While it's impossible to prove that the gamma surges correspond to these experiences, the parallels are intriguing. It suggests that the dying brain might be capable of producing vivid subjective states right at the threshold. Hospitals have also provided insights into the timing of brain death. In some studies, EEG monitoring has shown that brain activity can persist for minutes after cardiac arrest. In rare cases, low-level electrical activity has been recorded for as long as 10 minutes. Whether this activity reflects true consciousness is unclear. It may simply be scattered neuronal firing as energy reserves run out. but the fact that the brain does not always shut off instantly complicates our understanding of when awareness ends. Doctors and nurses often witness unusual behaviors at the end of life that add to the mystery. Some patients display sudden movements, muscle twitches, gasps, even brief attempts to sit up after the heart has stopped. These are usually explained as spinal reflexes, triggered by the final release of energy in the nervous system. But to families at the bedside, they can seem like signs of awareness, a last gesture before departure. Neuroscience suggests they are mechanical, but they reinforce how ambiguous the boundary of death can feel. Another phenomenon observed in hospitals is what some researchers call terminal spreading depolarization. This refers to a massive wave of electrical failure that sweeps across the brain as neurons lose their ability to maintain charge. This wave, first identified in patients who suffered severe strokes or head trauma, is considered the final event in the dying brain. It spreads from one region to another, silencing networks as it goes. To the extent that consciousness requires coordinated electrical activity, this wave may mark the precise point when awareness ceases. Even with these discoveries, one of the hardest questions remains: is there any subjective experience in those final surges? Neuroscience cannot answer directly. The EEG shows rhythms but not feelings. To interpret them, we must look at what survivors of cardiac arrest report. Many describe experiences that align with the timing of the surges. Visions of light, life reviews, or out-of-body sensations that seem to occur in seconds of clinical death. These reports lend support to the idea that the brain's last bursts of activity could produce powerful internal states. It's also worth noting how energy efficient the brain is in these moments. Even as oxygen runs out, neurons can fire in bursts for a short while, feeding on residual energy stores. The result may be a compressed, hyperactive version of consciousness, a kind of final show as systems collapse. If this is true, then the last moments of life may feel subjectively much longer than they are in clock time. Seconds of brain activity could stretch into what feels like minutes or more, contributing to the timeless quality of near-death experiences. Medical researchers are now beginning to study these events systematically. Large-scale projects such as the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, have tried to capture reports from patients who survive cardiac arrest and compare them to measurable events during resuscitation. While most patients do not recall experiences, a significant minority do, and some of their reports align with specific physiological markers. For example, awareness of events in the operating room has been described even when EEG suggested minimal activity, raising questions about how much we really understand about consciousness under duress. From the standpoint of neuroscience, however, the central point remains. The brain is active during the process of dying. It does not vanish instantly into silence. Instead, it passes through phases, surges of activity, disorganized firing, spreading depolarization, before reaching the flat line of irreversible death. Each of these phases may carry with it subjective experiences, though science cannot confirm their content. This knowledge has profound implications. It suggests that the last moments of life may not be empty. They may be filled with neural fireworks that shape a final conscious experience. Whether that experience is peaceful, chaotic, or transcendent likely depends on the interplay of brain systems and chemistry. For loved ones at the bedside, this possibility offers a measure of comfort. The dying person's mind may still be active, perhaps even producing meaningful experiences, even as the body fails. It also challenges us to rethink our definitions of the moment of death. If the brain continues to fire for seconds or minutes after the heart stops, when does consciousness truly end? Legally and clinically, we set boundaries for practical reasons, but biologically, death is a gradual unraveling. Consciousness may persist in fragments during that unraveling, and only at the final silence of the brain does it truly cease. To scientists, these studies are not just about death, but about consciousness itself. Observing the brain in its last moments provides a rare, natural experiment in how awareness arises and dissolves. It shows us that consciousness is not fragile in the way we might imagine. It can endure even in the face of catastrophic failure, at least for a short time. At the same time, it confirms its dependence on the living brain. Once the last surges and depolarizations have passed, awareness is gone. In summary, what modern hospital studies reveal is that death is not an immediate event for the brain. There are measurable, dynamic patterns of activity right at the threshold. These may explain near-death experiences, life reviews, and visions of light. They also show that the end of consciousness is more complex than a switch being flipped. It is a process, one that neuroscience is only beginning to chart in detail, and in those fleeting final sparks, we may glimpse both the resilience of the human brain and the profound mystery of its ultimate silence. One of the greatest puzzles in neuroscience is defining exactly what consciousness is. We know it involves subjective awareness, the feeling of being present, perceiving the world, and experiencing thoughts, sensations, and emotions. But how does a lump of biological tissue composed of billions of neurons generate that feeling? This question lies at the heart of what is often called the hard problem of consciousness. While no theory has fully solved it, neuroscience has developed models that attempt to explain the mechanisms by which the brain produces awareness. These models also help us understand why consciousness ceases when the brain dies. Perhaps the most influential of these models is integrated information theory, or IIT, proposed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. According to IIT, consciousness arises when information in the brain is both highly integrated and highly differentiated. In other words, awareness requires a system that can combine vast amounts of information into a unified whole, while at the same time maintaining fine-grained distinctions between different experiences. A brain with high phi, the measure IIT uses for integration, produces rich conscious states. A brain with low phi, such as during deep anesthesia or after death, produces none. This theory has direct implications for what happens as the brain shuts down. In the moments before death, as neurons lose their ability to communicate, the brain's integration capacity collapses. Networks that normally link sensory, emotional, and cognitive areas fall apart. According to IIT, this means phi drops rapidly towards zero, and with it, consciousness itself dissolves. The surge of gamma activity observed in dying brains may represent a final, chaotic attempt at integration before the system disintegrates. But without ongoing metabolism to sustain connections, the brain cannot maintain awareness for long. Another key model is global workspace theory, or GWT, developed by Bernard Baars and expanded by Stanislas Dehaene. GWT suggests that consciousness functions like a spotlight in a theatre. Many unconscious processes take place behind the scenes, but only a small subset of information is broadcast onto the global workspace, where it becomes accessible to attention, decision-making, and memory. This broadcast is what we experience as conscious awareness. From this perspective, consciousness depends on the ability of the brain to sustain widespread communication between regions. The prefrontal cortex, parietal areas, and thalamus play central roles in orchestrating this broadcast. During sleep, anesthesia, or coma, the broadcast breaks down and consciousness fades. At death, when blood flow stops and neurons fail, the global workspace goes dark. Without the ability to distribute information across the brain, awareness simply cannot exist. These theories highlight why neuroscience generally rejects the idea that consciousness can continue independently of the brain. Consciousness is not a separate substance that detaches at death. It is an emergent property of physical interactions in neural networks. When those networks collapse, so too does the emergent phenomenon. In this view, asking what happens to consciousness after death is like asking where the flame goes when a candle is blown out. The flame does not go anywhere. It ceases because the conditions that sustained it no longer exist. Predictive processing provides yet another lens. This framework suggests that the brain's main job is to predict sensory input. It constantly generates models of the world and updates them based on incoming signals. Consciousness arises from this ongoing process of prediction and error correction. Our sense of self and reality are essentially the brain's best guesses, constantly refined by feedback. But predictive processing depends on active sensory input and functioning neural circuits. When the heart stops and blood flow ceases, prediction collapses. The brain can no longer test its models against reality. In the final moments, it may generate uncontrolled predictions, producing hallucinations or life reviews. But once neuronal activity ends, the predictive engine halts entirely. Consciousness, as a process of modeling, is extinguished. Neuroscience also studies consciousness through the concept of neural correlates, the minimal mechanisms required to support awareness. Research has identified networks such as the default mode network, the frontoparietal network, and thalamocortical loops as central players. These structures allow the integration, broadcasting, and prediction described by the theories. But all of them rely on active neurons, functioning synapses, and continuous energy supply. When oxygen runs out, these systems fail within seconds. Consciousness cannot exist without them, because they are the very substrate that produces it. Still, theories do not fully capture the subjective mystery. Why should integration, global broadcasting, or prediction feel like anything from the inside? That question remains unanswered. But for the purposes of death, the models provide a framework. They explain why consciousness is inherently tied to the living brain, and why, when the brain ceases to function, there is no continuation of awareness in a scientific sense. Interestingly, some researchers are testing ways to measure consciousness in real time. For example, by applying magnetic pulses to the brain and measuring the complexity of resulting activity, scientists can estimate the level of integration. This approach has been used to distinguish between conscious and unconscious states in patients. In the future, it may help determine more precisely when consciousness has faded in dying patients. For now, it reinforces the link between complexity of brain activity and awareness. There is also a philosophical dimension to these models. If consciousness is an emergent property, then it is not a thing that can travel or persist. It is more like a process dependent on conditions. Death, then, is the termination of those conditions. The brain's architecture, energy flow, and connectivity make consciousness possible. Without them, there is no awareness left to migrate or survive. That said, neuroscience does not deny the reality of near-death experiences. It explains them as the brain's final productions, not as glimpses of an afterlife. The life review, the tunnel of light, the sense of peace, all can be accounted for by surges in activity, collapsing networks, and predictive hallucinations. These experiences feel profoundly real because they are generated by the same machinery that normally produces waking reality. But when the machinery stops, so too does experience. In this sense, theories of consciousness do not diminish the importance of these final experiences. If anything, they highlight their poignancy. The last sparks of awareness may be some of the most intense moments the brain ever produces, compressing memory, perception, and meaning into a brief flood. Neuroscience cannot say what it feels like to die, but it can describe why the brain is capable of producing vivid experiences even at the end. Together, integrated information theory, global workspace theory, and predictive processing converge on a key point. Consciousness is inseparable from the living brain. It emerges from complex interactions among billions of neurons. When those interactions break down, awareness fades and finally ceases. There is no evidence that consciousness floats free or persists independently. Instead, it is a fragile but astonishing phenomenon of biology, extinguished when the brain that sustains it comes to an end. This conclusion may sound stark, but it also deepens our appreciation for what consciousness is. It shows us that every moment of awareness, every memory, every feeling, every sense of self is the product of an extraordinary physical process. Death is the end of that process, but the process itself is one of the most remarkable achievements of evolution. Understanding it helps us not only face mortality with clearer eyes, but also value the fleeting miracle of being conscious at all. Our sense of self depends on memory. Without it, we could not recognize our own face, recall our name, or feel continuity from one moment to the next. Neuroscience has shown that memory is not stored in a single place, but is distributed across networks of the brain. These networks are the scaffolding of identity, and when they fail, the self unravels. The hippocampus, located deep in the temporal lobe, plays a central role in forming new memories. It takes fragments of sensory information, sights, sounds, emotions, and binds them into coherent episodes. These episodes are then linked to the neocortex for long-term storage. This system is why we can remember our first day of school, a family gathering, or what we ate for breakfast yesterday. Without the hippocampus, as famously demonstrated in patients with damage to this region, new memories cannot form. The person remains conscious, but stuck in a perpetual present. Identity, however, is more than episodic memory. The prefrontal cortex integrates our past with our goals and values, creating a narrative sense of self. The default mode network, active during introspection, ties together memories, imagination, and self-referential thought. Together, these systems produce the feeling that I am the same person I was yesterday and will be tomorrow. This continuity is the essence of personal identity. Neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's provide a window into what happens when these systems break down. In Alzheimer's, the hippocampus is among the first structures to deteriorate. Patients lose the ability to form new memories and gradually forget old ones. As the disease spreads, the narrative of self fragments. Loved ones may describe that the person they knew is no longer there, even though the body remains alive. This tragic process illustrates how intimately the the self depends on memory networks. Without them, consciousness may persist, but identity fades. At death, the same principle applies on a faster scale. As blood flow ceases, the hippocampus and cortical networks shut down. The ability to retrieve or integrate memories vanishes. Whatever sense of self we have in those final moments is fragile, held together by residual activity that soon disintegrates. The continuity that defined us, the thread linking our childhood to our last breath, breaks. From a neuroscience perspective, this means that identity cannot survive the death of the brain. This is not to say memory is always lost instantly. Some reports from near-death experiences include vivid life reviews, as if decades of memories are suddenly replayed. Neuroscientists suggest this could result from abnormal activity in the hippocampus and temporal lobes during oxygen deprivation. Instead of gradually retrieving memories, the brain may release them in a flood. The subjective sense of seeing one's life flash before the eyes could be the hippocampus firing chaotically as it collapses. This would explain why the experience feels comprehensive, even though it likely lasts only seconds. Memory research also shows us why the idea of consciousness continuing after death is problematic. If memory defines identity, then for a person to survive, those memory networks would need to persist. But neurons do not transmit information once their metabolic support ends. Synapses decay, and with them, the stored patterns that encode experiences. There is no known mechanism by which memories could detach and exist independently of the biological brain. Without memory, even if awareness were somehow possible, it would not be you in any recognizable sense. Philosophers have debated whether identity requires memory. John Locke argued that personal identity is rooted in the continuity of consciousness through memory. More recent thinkers point out that even without perfect memory, a person can maintain identity through overlapping chains of recollection. Neuroscience supports this, showing that identity is distributed across multiple systems. Episodic memory, semantic knowledge, emotional associations, but all of them rely on neural structures that fail at death. The collapse of memory networks means the collapse of personal identity. Interestingly, neuroscience has also shown how malleable memory is. We think of memory as a recording, but in reality, it is a reconstruction. Each time we recall an event, the brain rebuilds it from stored fragments, often altering details. This plasticity is part of what makes us human. It allows us to reinterpret the past and adapt our self-narrative, but it also highlights how deeply dependent memory is on living processes. If recall requires active reconstruction, then when those processes cease, memory ceases too. There is no static storage that can endure after death. The default mode network provides another angle. This network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, and angular gyrus, is most active when we are thinking about ourselves, daydreaming, remembering, imagining. It is essentially the brain's self-reflective mode. Functional MRI studies show that when the default mode network is disrupted by deep anesthesia, psychedelics, or brain injury, the sense of self diminishes or dissolves. At death, when the network falls silent permanently, the narrative self vanishes entirely. Even in ordinary life, we can glimpse how fragile the self is. Consider cases of amnesia where patients lose decades of memory. They may still be conscious, but without their personal history, they feel unmoored. Or consider split brain patients, where communication between hemispheres is severed. Each hemisphere develops its own sense of self, suggesting that identity is not a singular entity, but a construction dependent on communication. These cases reinforce the idea that the self is not indestructible. It is a product of neural architecture, vulnerable to change, and ultimately erased at death. Some might argue that the core self, the feeling of being an experiencing subject, could survive without memory. Neuroscience acknowledges that basic forms of consciousness, like raw perception, can exist without autobiographical memory, but even these require active thalamocortical circuits, which fail rapidly when the brain dies. So while it is theoretically possible for a flicker of awareness to persist after memory collapses, it cannot last long, and it cannot preserve identity. The neuroscience of identity at death points to a sobering but profound conclusion. Who we are is inseparable from the living brain. Memory, narrative, selfhood, all are woven into neural patterns that depend on energy and communication. When those patterns disintegrate, the self does not migrate elsewhere. It ceases just as surely as a story ends when the book's pages are burned. Yet this understanding also brings a kind of beauty. It means that our identity is not something abstract, but something embodied, grounded in the intricate dance of neurons. Every moment of recall, every sense of continuity, is a triumph of biology. Appreciating this makes the self more precious, not less. It reminds us that the memories we form and share are finite and therefore deeply valuable. From this vantage point, the neuroscience of death does not strip away meaning, but heightens it. If memory and identity end with the brain, then the time we have to build them is the only time we will ever have. Each experience, each relationship, each story we tell about ourselves is unique to the span of our conscious life. Death closes the book, but while it is open, we are authors of something extraordinary. The self. Consciousness is not only built on memory and selfhood, it is also infused with emotion. Every experience we have is colored by feeling: joy, fear, sadness, peace. Emotions give meaning to our lives and shape the way we interpret reality. To understand what happens to consciousness at death, we must ask not only what happens to memory and awareness, but also what happens to emotion in the dying brain. The emotional core of the brain lies in the limbic system, a collection of structures that includes the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and cingulate cortex. These regions work together to evaluate the significance of events and generate emotional responses. The amygdala, for instance, tags stimuli as threatening or rewarding. The hypothalamus regulates bodily reactions, from increased heart rate to the release of stress hormones. The cingulate cortex integrates emotional states with attention and decision-making. Together, these systems ensure that consciousness is never neutral. It is always tilted toward meaning through feeling. At the end of life, these systems are under enormous strain. As oxygen levels fall and metabolism collapses, the balance of neurotransmitters shifts dramatically. Glutamate, the brain's main excitatory chemical, floods synapses when energy supplies fail. Normally, glutamate is carefully regulated, but at death it accumulates, overstimulating neurons. This can lead to excitotoxicity, a destructive process that contributes to the shutting down of networks. At the same time, inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA may decline, removing the brain's usual checks and balances. The result is a storm of uncontrolled firing. Interestingly, this chemical chaos may not feel purely negative. Surges of endorphins, the brain's natural opioids, are also released under extreme stress. These chemicals reduce pain and produce feelings of calm or even euphoria. Research suggests that endorphin release is one reason why people in severe trauma sometimes report feeling detached from pain. At death, this same mechanism may provide comfort, softening the experience of physical decline. Other neurotransmitters, such as serotonin and dopamine, also play a role. Serotonin helps regulate mood and perception, while dopamine is linked to reward and motivation. In the final moments, as regulation breaks down, bursts of serotonin and dopamine may contribute to altered states of consciousness, feelings of peace, visions, or heightened clarity. While these experiences are short-lived, they may profoundly shape the emotional tone of dying. Clinical observations support this idea. Many people who have near-death experiences describe overwhelming feelings of love, peace, or acceptance, even when their bodies are in crisis. Neuroscience interprets these feelings as the product of chemical and neural changes in the brain's emotional systems. The amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex may be firing abnormally, producing intense but comforting sensations. What feels spiritual or transcendent may be rooted in the brain's attempt to stabilize itself as it shuts down. Meaning itself is deeply tied to emotion. The brain does not process experiences as raw data. It tags them with significance. The limbic system and prefrontal cortex work together to determine what matters and why. This is why a song, a face, or a smell can carry emotional weight far beyond its physical properties. At the end of life, these meaning-making circuits may become hyperactive, producing the sense of profound importance reported in many near-death accounts. A simple light or sound may feel deeply significant because the brain is amplifying emotional salience. In this way, death may not feel like a fading into nothingness, but like an intensification of meaning. The collapsing brain may flood consciousness with emotionally charged imagery and sensations. Memories may be revisited not just as facts, but as experiences saturated with feeling, regret, joy, gratitude. This could explain why life reviews often carry moral or emotional weight, as if the brain is summarizing not just what happened, but what mattered. Of course, not all emotional experiences at death are peaceful. Some reports describe fear, confusion, or distress. Neuroscience suggests these too are rooted in the brain's chemistry. The amygdala, when hyperactivated, produces fear responses. If endorphin release is insufficient, or if glutamate flooding overwhelms control circuits, the dying brain may generate frightening hallucinations or panic. This variability reminds us that dying is not the same for everyone. The balance of neurotransmitters, personal health, and psychological state all influence the final emotional experience. Hospice care provides important insight here. Many patients nearing death report visions of loved ones, feelings of comfort, or a sense of approaching peace. While some interpret these as spiritual encounters, neuroscience sees them as the brain's natural processes. Memories activated by the hippocampus, combined with emotional coloring from the limbic system. What matters most is that these experiences are often reassuring, helping people let go. Whether rooted in biology or something beyond, they reflect the brain's capacity to create meaning even at the threshold. From a neuroscientific view, meaning itself is an emergent property. The brain does not passively register reality. It actively constructs significance by linking perception, memory, and emotion. The prefrontal cortex plays a central role, weighing experiences against goals and values. The limbic system supplies emotional coloring, and the hippocampus anchors meaning in memory. At death, when these systems destabilize, the meaning-making process may shift into overdrive. The brain, in its final acts, might attempt to make sense of everything at once, producing experiences that feel profound. This perspective also explains why cultural and personal factors shape dying experiences. People from different backgrounds report different visions. Some see religious figures, others see family, others see light or abstract patterns. Neuroscience suggests that the content is drawn from memory and expectation, but the emotional tone, the sense of significance, comes from the limbic system. In other words, the brain may use whatever images are available in memory to express its final emotional surge. Ultimately, the neuroscience of emotion at death shows that our final experiences are not empty or meaningless. They are charged with feeling, shaped by the chemistry of a brain in transition. Whether peaceful or turbulent, these emotions reflect the same biological systems that color our lives every day. The difference is that at death, they may be intensified, compressed, and unrestrained. This raises a deeper question. If meaning is constructed by the brain, does it vanish at death? Neuroscience answers yes. Without neural activity, there is no system left to evaluate significance. Just as memory and identity dissolve when the brain ceases, so too does meaning. The feelings that once made life rich cannot persist without the circuits that generated them. In this sense, death is not only the end of awareness, but the end of meaning itself. Yet there is something paradoxically meaningful about this. Knowing that the brain constructs significance reminds us that meaning is not handed to us from outside, it is created within. Every relationship, every purpose, every joy we experience is the product of our neural machinery. At death, that machinery ends, but the meaning it created during life remains in the world, in the memories of others, in the stories we leave behind, in the changes we made while we were conscious. In sum, the neuroscience of emotion and meaning at death reveals that the dying brain is not silent, but active, flooded with chemicals, surging with abnormal activity, and deeply engaged in producing feelings that shape our last conscious moments. These feelings may be peaceful or fearful, but they are always significant because emotion and meaning are inseparable from consciousness. And when the brain finally ceases, those feelings vanish, leaving only the traces of the meaning we created while alive. Time is one of the most fundamental dimensions of conscious experience. From the moment we wake to the moment we fall asleep, our awareness is structured by the sense that time flows forward. We anticipate what comes next, recall what has passed, and situate ourselves in the ever-changing now. Without time, consciousness would be a disjointed series of impressions, lacking continuity. To understand what happens to consciousness at death, we must examine how the brain constructs time and how this construction unravels when the brain shuts down. Unlike clocks, the brain has no single mechanism for measuring time. Instead, time perception emerges from the interaction of multiple neural systems. The basal ganglia, cerebellum, and prefrontal cortex all play key roles. The basal ganglia use dopamine-driven circuits to process intervals and rhythms, allowing us to predict when things will happen. The cerebellum fine-tunes timing for movements and sensory integration. The prefrontal cortex provides higher-order timekeeping, linking moments into sequences and planning across minutes, hours, or days. Together, these systems weave the sensation of temporal flow that defines conscious experience. At death, these systems begin to fail. Dopamine release collapses, disrupting the brain's ability to track intervals. Oxygen deprivation impairs cerebellar function, making motor timing unreliable. The prefrontal cortex, already fragile under stress, loses its capacity to integrate past, present, and future. Time perception becomes unstable. Moments may feel elongated or compressed, and the normal sense of continuity begins to fragment. Evidence from near-death experiences strongly suggests that time distortion is common as death approaches. Many people report that time slowed down, sometimes to the point where entire lifetimes felt as though they unfolded in seconds. Others describe timelessness, an experience of existing outside of ordinary duration, where past and future blend into a single, eternal now. Neuroscience interprets these reports as the result of disrupted timing circuits in the brain. When normal temporal regulation collapses, subjective time can warp in extraordinary ways. One key factor is the role of the hippocampus in linking events into sequences. The hippocampus not only stores episodic memory, but also encodes the temporal order of experiences. When oxygen levels drop, hippocampal function becomes erratic, leading to fragmented or non-linear memories. This may explain why people near death often report life reviews, in which memories appear all at once rather than in chronological order. Instead of being arranged in sequence, experiences may be retrieved in parallel, creating the impression of timeless recall. The amygdala also contributes to altered time perception. Under extreme stress, the amygdala heightens attention and can make moments feel elongated. This is an adaptive mechanism. When danger arises, slowing down subjective time allows an organism to react more quickly. At death, when the amygdala is hyperactivated by fear, pain, or novelty, it may stretch moments to unnatural length. What is actually a few seconds of neural activity may feel like minutes or hours. Neurochemical changes further exaggerate this effect. Surges of dopamine, often triggered by extreme stress or trauma, are known to distort time perception. Dopamine alters the brain's internal clocks in the basal ganglia, making intervals feel shorter or longer than they are. In dying brains, dopamine spikes may combine with abnormal hippocampal and amygdala activity to produce the sensation of expanded or suspended time. One striking example comes from cardiac arrest survivors. Many report that during the few seconds after their heart stopped, they experienced what felt like entire journeys, visions, or reviews of their lives. Neuroscience suggests that this is not because time truly stretched, but because their brains, in chaos, generated immense amounts of experience in compressed real time. The density of neural firing created the illusion of extended duration. Consciousness, under stress, may pack a lifetime into a heartbeat. The question of timelessness is particularly fascinating. How can a brain, designed to track time, generate an experience outside of time? One possibility lies in the collapse of the prefrontal cortex's ability to maintain sequential order. Normally, the prefrontal cortex strings moments together into a coherent line. Without it, moments may exist in isolation or all at once, producing the impression of timeless awareness. In this state, consciousness may feel detached from the usual rhythm of before and after. This idea aligns with research on altered states of consciousness induced by meditation, psychedelics, or deep flow states. In these conditions, people often report timelessness, where the sense of past and future fades. Neuroimaging studies show that such states involve reduced activity in the default mode network and altered prefrontal connectivity. At death, similar disruptions occur, though far more dramatically, as neural circuits lose coherence. The timelessness of near-death experiences may therefore be a natural byproduct of the brain's collapse. Another dimension of time perception is the speed of thought itself. The brain normally processes information in cycles governed by oscillations such as alpha and gamma rhythms. These rhythms pace how quickly thoughts can form. Under stress or trauma, oscillatory patterns change, often accelerating. When neural processing speeds up, subjective time feels slower because more mental events are packed into each second. At death, bursts of gamma activity observed in animal studies suggest that the brain may briefly accelerate into a hyperconscious state. For the dying person, this could feel like stepping into a slowed, expanded reality. It is important to note that these distortions are not illusions in the trivial sense. They are genuine experiences of altered temporal consciousness, just as real to the person as ordinary time flow. From a neuroscience perspective, subjective time is always a construction, and at death, that construction becomes unstable. Whether time feels stretched, collapsed, or absent, it reflects the brain's final attempts to regulate a system that can no longer sustain itself. This raises profound implications for what death feels like. Physically, the process may take only minutes, but subjectively, it could feel much longer. A person may experience enough neural activity in their final seconds to fill what feels like hours. In this sense, consciousness may grant us more time than biology provides. The last moment of awareness may be expanded, giving the dying person the impression of lingering in a rich, extended present. From the outside, death appears abrupt. Brain activity ceases, the body grows still, and time runs out. But from the inside, it may be anything but abrupt. The brain, in collapse, may create a final window of extended or timeless experience. Neuroscience cannot yet say exactly how long this window lasts in subjective terms, but evidence suggests it could feel significant, perhaps even like stepping into eternity, even if only for seconds. Ultimately, the neuroscience of time, at death, highlights the fragile and constructed nature of temporal experience. Time is not an external force flowing through the mind, but a product of neural circuits. When those circuits falter, time itself falters. For the dying brain, this may mean that the final act of consciousness is not a flicker, but a vast, stretched landscape of awareness, unbound by ordinary clocks. In this way, the neuroscience of death reminds us that time, like memory and meaning, is a creation of the brain. When the brain ceases, time ceases for us. But in the moments leading up to that end, time may expand, contract, or dissolve altogether, giving consciousness a final, extraordinary perspective on existence. Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Sleep Space. Over the course of this journey, we've explored one of the deepest mysteries of existence: what happens to consciousness when life ends. We've looked at it through the lens of neuroscience, grounding our exploration in the intricate workings of the brain. From neural networks that generate awareness, to the fragile construction of self, memory, meaning, and time, we've seen how consciousness is bound to biology, and what happens when biology unravels. Tonight, as we close, we'll bring all of these threads together, reflecting on what science reveals about the end of awareness, and what it means for the mystery of being alive. Consciousness begins in the brain's astonishing networks of cells, neurons communicating through electrical impulses and chemical signals give rise to the subjective world we each inhabit. Every sensation, every thought, every emotion is the product of coordinated activity across billions of neurons. The prefrontal cortex shapes selfhood, the hippocampus anchors memory, the limbic system infuses experience with feeling, and the basal ganglia and cerebellum pace the rhythm of time. Together, these circuits generate the seamless illusion of a self moving through a meaningful world. At death, these systems break down. Oxygen deprivation disrupts the delicate balance of excitatory and inhibitory signaling. Glutamate floods synapses, neurons fire chaotically, and the ordered patterns of brain activity dissolve into disarray. Networks that once supported coherent thought collapse. The continuity of memory fragments. The sense of self disintegrates. Emotions surge and fade. Time itself warps, stretches, or disappears. In the final moments, consciousness is likely altered beyond recognition, a storm of neural activity that may feel expansive, profound, or chaotic. And then, with the final cessation of neural activity, awareness ends. Neuroscience is clear. Without the brain, consciousness cannot be sustained. There is no evidence that awareness persists once neural activity stops. Just as turning off a light extinguishes illumination, shutting down the brain extinguishes the mind. This conclusion is sobering, but it is also honest. From a scientific standpoint, death marks the end of subjective experience. There is no longer a self to perceive, no longer a mind to feel. The mystery of what it is like to die is resolved not in continuation, but in cessation. And yet within this ending lies its own kind of wonder. For if consciousness ends at death, then it is a finite gift, bounded by the span of a life. Every moment of awareness, every memory formed, every emotion felt is precious precisely because it does not last forever. Neuroscience reminds us that meaning is not given to us from outside. It is constructed within the brain, through the interplay of memory, emotion, and self. At death, that construction collapses, but during life it allows us to create purpose, love, beauty, and truth. What about the reports of near-death experiences, visions of light, feelings of timelessness, encounters with loved ones? Neuroscience explains these not as glimpses of another world, but as products of the dying brain. Surges of endorphins provide comfort. Abnormal hippocampal activity unleashes memory. The amygdala amplifies significance, and timekeeping circuits falter, creating the sense of eternity. These experiences are real, but they are rooted in biology. They reveal not a continuation beyond death, but the brain's final artistry in shaping experience as it fails. This does not diminish their importance. On the contrary, it deepens it. The brain, even in its collapse, generates meaning and comfort. It transforms the biological process of dying into an experience that often feels profound to the person living it. In this way, neuroscience does not strip away the wonder of death, but reframes it as part of the extraordinary story of consciousness itself. When we step back, we see a remarkable arc. Consciousness arises slowly in childhood, as networks of the brain mature. It flourishes through life, weaving together self, memory, emotion, and time into the tapestry of personal existence. And then at death, it unravels, collapsing back into silence. The story of consciousness is not one of permanence, but of emergence and dissolution. It is a cycle bounded by birth and death, shaped entirely by the fragile organ within our skulls. For many, this conclusion is unsettling. The idea that awareness ends, that there is nothing beyond, can feel like a loss. But neuroscience also offers a way to reframe this reality. If consciousness is finite, then each moment of it matters infinitely more. The beauty of existence lies not in its eternity, but in its transience. Every conversation, every sunset, every fleeting thought is precious because it will not last forever. In this light, death is not an erasure of meaning, but the frame that gives meaning to life. Sleep provides a metaphor here. Every night, we surrender consciousness. The brain shifts into different rhythms, awareness fades, and the self temporarily dissolves. In the morning, consciousness returns and life resumes. Death is not the same as sleep. Sleep is reversible. Death is not. But the comparison reminds us of the fragility and fluidity of awareness. Consciousness is not permanent, even in life. It flickers, shifts, and pauses. Death is simply the final pause, the one from which there is no return. Still, while neuroscience can explain how consciousness ends, it cannot fully capture what consciousness is. The hard problem remains unsolved. Why does neural activity produce subjective experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be alive rather than nothing? This is the enduring mystery, and it is here that death retains its deepest enigma. For if we do not fully understand why consciousness exists, we cannot fully grasp what it means for it to end. Science can map the circuitry, trace the chemistry, and describe the breakdown. But the essence of awareness, the vivid first-person quality of it, remains elusive. This humility is important. Neuroscience brings us closer to understanding, but it does not close the mystery entirely. Death from the inside may feel stranger and more profound than any explanation we can offer. Perhaps in the last moments, as time dissolves and the self unravels, consciousness reveals something we cannot study or measure. Or perhaps it simply ends in silence, as the science suggests. Either way, the mystery of consciousness ensures that death remains, in some sense, unknowable. And so we return to where we began, with curiosity, wonder, and reflection. We live our lives moving through time, building memories, constructing selves, and seeking meaning. Neuroscience shows us how fragile these processes are, how deeply they depend on the brain. At death, they dissolve. Consciousness does not continue beyond the body. And yet, what it creates while alive, the love we give, the knowledge we share, the traces we leave in others, continues to ripple outward. The end of awareness is not the end of impact. As we close tonight's exploration, take a moment to reflect on the gift of being conscious now. The brain's fragile machinery grants us this moment of awareness, this chance to experience the world, to wonder, to ask questions about existence. Death is the end of this gift, but life is the opportunity to use it fully. So as you drift into sleep tonight, remember that consciousness is both fragile and profound. It does not last forever, but while it is here, it is everything, and in that awareness lies its greatest wonder. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Good night.